So let me introduce our distinguished keynote speaker to you. Dipesh Chakrabarty is a Lawrence Kempton Distinguished Service Professor of History, South Asian Languages and Civilizations at the University of Chicago. He's the recipient of the 2014 Toynbee Prize that recognizes significant academic and public contributions to humanity. Moreover, he received the 2019 Tagore Memorial Prize awarded by the government of West Bengal for his book, The Crisis of Civilization. Dipesh Chakrabarty studied physics and management in Calcutta. He received a PhD in history from the Australian National University in Canberra in 1984. Dipesh has had an extensive and impressive program of visiting lectureships: Princeton, Calcutta, Göttingen and Berlin in Germany, Sydney, Delhi, New York, Vienna, or Paris, and that is just mentioning a few. He was a member of the Subaltern Studies Group, the Subaltern Studies Collective, which with Antonio Gramsci describes decolonization from below. Dipesh has thus made important contributions to the intersections between history and postcolonial theory. Among his first major publications was Rethinking Working Class History from 1989. In 2000, he became renowned for his very influential book, Provincializing Europe, Postcolonial Thought and Historical Difference, which was also translated into German. There he argues for a provincialization of Europe, which should replace Eurocentric view on other societies. European historicism has always told other peoples, not yet. You are not yet developed and civilized. However, European thinking cannot be given up, according to Dipesh Chakrabarty, since its emphasis on emancipation provides the victims of European colonization with the very concepts that can be used to critique European domination. A few years later, Dipesh's thinking on subalternity and history went, I quote, straight past the world of nature until my train of postcolonial thought crashed into the planetarity of the 2010s. Dipesh Chakrabarty has since then become one of the most important social, political, and historical researchers on the concept of the Anthropocene. The beginning was marked by a highly acclaimed essay from 2009, The Climate of History, 4th thesis, in which Dipesh raises the question of whether human history and the history of the Earth should not be much more closely intertwined. In 2018, the already mentioned The Crisis of Civilization, exploring on global and planetary histories appeared. Professor Chakrabarty's most recent book is The Climate of History in the Planetary Age, which will appear with University of Chicago in a few weeks, I guess. It's mentioned that it will appear in March 2021. Dipesh, we are very honored to have you with us. We are looking forward to your lecture on sustainability and habitability, the planetary age in human history, and afterwards we will have time for a discussion. Thank you very much for being with us. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Frank, for that very warm introduction. And also thanks to you and Sigat for inviting me to address this conference. It's a great honor. And I'm very pleased to be here. So a very good morning from Chicago to probably to all of you. I don't know, you're probably in different time zones, but the morning here is so snowy, but not too bad by Chicago standards. So I'll speak for 50 minutes and I'll start a timer. And when the timer goes off, I will just stop. And if there's things left to be said, hopefully we'll pick them up in the question and answer session and things will clarify themselves. Okay, so I've started my timer. So I speak to you really as a humanist. I think of myself less of a social scientist and more of a humanist. And before I begin to address the topic, let me also dedicate this lecture to the memory of not just the Nobel, but also the Nobel scientist, Paul Crutzen. I will touch on three topics. One is, the first point would be to explain what I mean by planetary age in human history. And my diagnosis depends on the distinction I've come to make between the globe and the planet. I'll therefore explain my idea of planetary age with the help of that distinction. And it is in the course of drawing out the distinction that I'll speak of sustainability and habitability as two distinct categories. Secondly, I'll speak on the relationship, as I see it, between human flourishing, geological agency of what I regard as human dominant complexes, and what some geologists call the technosphere. And here I will introduce Carl Schmitt's idea of unencumbered technology as a condition of our civilizational existence. And finally, I will argue that the very nature of our urban-based high-tech civilization introduces certain degrees of inflexibility in our options and makes us increasingly dependent on scientific technological fixes, or there's a tendency towards that. So let me first begin with the planetary age and the globe-planet distinction. So when I started to work on climate change and was working with these two expressions, globalization and global warming, the popular literature on these phenomena begin at the same time, though a lot of people who are working on globalization were not necessarily reading the literature on global warming. Even though IPCC was set up in the late 1980s, 1988 or 89, I forget, but around that year, James Hansen spoke to the US government about global warming. But if you look at globalization literature and people who came out of my kind of background in post-colonial studies, Homi Bhabha, Arjun Appadurai, Gayatri Spivak, these people were much more tuned into into differences between human beings, what Balibar once called anthropological differences of culture, of history, but not so much into the question of global warming, and not even the question of environment, which came late in post-colonial studies, even though environment movement was on, and the idea of one world was already forming itself by the end of the 1970s. Europe had green parties, particularly in Germany, but these thoughts were not necessarily connecting together. And it's really while I was working on on the question of planetary climate change that both speaking to and reading some of what the French philosopher Catherine Malabou was writing made me realize that even though in English we use the word globe to speak of globalization and global warming, the word globe had different meanings in these two expressions. And it's really working on this problem. What were the ways in which the word globe was different in the two expressions that I eventually came to make a distinction between the globe and the planet. And they're not, even though I make a distinction, don't think of it as a binary opposition. They're actually interconnected. I separate them for the purpose of analysis and exposition. The planet and the globe are basically different perspectives on human history. They're both products of post-imperial 20th century and of the years dominated by the Cold War and its enduring legacies. And capitalism and technology feature prominently in the history of the emergence of these categories, though there are some critical differences. The globe is a product of human-built infrastructure. I think Carl Schmitt's Nomos of the Earth still gives us a plausible way to track the story of its origins in the history of technology and empires. And we could say that it begins with Europeans building ships that could navigate the deep seas. I mean, the Dutch flourished at this, but obviously the Portuguese had it, the Spanish had it, and eventually, of course, English came to dominate that scene. But it's really beginning with this capacity to circumnavigate the Earth. And coming today, I will talk about this Zoom platform we are meeting on, the emblematic picture of the Earth from taken by astronauts called the Blue Marble in 1972. These are all pictures of the globe. That is, it is a way of connecting this sphere infrastructurally, so that and so that these connections themselves, like the Zoom connection, uh, create their own sense of time-space compression. So fusing my morning with somebody's evening is what Zoom, these kind of connections can do. So the globe is fundamentally a human-centric construction. Humans are its main protagonists, and stories of globalization have to have humans at their center. This is what I think Frank was referring to as zooming in. The planet, by which I mean the Earth system, the sense in which scientists speak of a planetary climate system or of a science called Earth system science. The planet, by its very nature, that is Earth system, as understood, by its very nature decenters the human. So you have to realize that this, even though it has roots going back even to the 19th century, Earth system science is a fairly recent science, interdisciplinary. NASA set up its first committee on Earth system science around 1983. But it comes out of the competition in space. It comes out of the Cold War in both American and Soviet interest in studying atmosphere, in studying if weather could be weaponized, in studying nuclear fallout of the explosions, and in this competition for space, and in thinking whether Mars could be inhabited, whether other planets could be colonized, whether you could have military or civil bases in other planets. Out of that, that all is part of the history of the development of Earth system science, as well as the climate science, climate models as they eventually developed. But the decentering, the way it decenters us, unlike the stories of globalization, so the story of the globe, I was saying, has humans at its center. But one of the commonest and easiest example of this decentering of the human is really what is called the modern atmosphere of the planet, which is about the story of the share of oxygen in the air. Now, as you know, the oxygen now is about 21% of the atmosphere. We critically depend on it. Plants depend on it. Many other animals depend on this air. But the interesting thing about the air is that this air, the atmosphere, has maintained oxygen, not always at 21%, but at a level which has ensured that neither the forests have ever gone up in flames, which would have happened if there was too much oxygen, nor have the animals choked to death, which would have happened if there was too little oxygen. And the interesting thing about oxygen is that oxygen, being a highly reactive gas, mixes up with other gases. So what you have to do to keep this share of oxygen and to maintain the level of it, you have to constantly supply the air with fresh oxygen. And first of all, you ask who has been doing this, and then you find out that it's really what we consider to be inferior forms of life. It's planktons, it's bacteria, it's plants. So all of these things all of these creatures have a role in supplying the air with fresh oxygen. So if we actually, through global warming, if the seas warm up so much that the planktons die, we will be shutting off a source of oxygen for the air. And then you ask, how long have these creatures been doing this for? How old is this so-called modern atmosphere of the planet? And the answer is that the modern atmosphere is about 375 million years old. And so you can see that the atmosphere wasn't created with us in view, even though it's absolutely essential to our existence. We can't actually live without this atmosphere. And it's in this sense, Earth system science decenters human in the simple way that geology, a subject like geology or evolutionary biology, can never have humans at its center, because humans just come too late in the story. So So the other distinction I want to make very quickly, and I would be happy to pick it up in the Q&A sessions, is that there is something that separates the planet from the categories we've used so far, the globe, the world, and actually Heidegger introduced the category Earth in 1936 in a lecture he gave in Frankfurt, and Gadamer has very interesting things to say about the introduction of the category. The difference is that when we think of ourselves as inhabiting the world or even the Earth, in Heideggerian terms, there is a sense of mutuality between humans and the Earth. So Heidegger would say the Earth, as it were, rises up as the sap of a tree when we approach the tree and greets us with its fruit. So as if there is a kind of mutuality. I mean, the mutuality doesn't mean harmony, because he talks about equipmental breakdown before him. I mean, so that there's always what Kierkegaard would have called anxiety or dread in this relationship. But even so, there is mutuality. The planet is a category that always reduces humans when it has the capacity to reduce humans to our purely creaturely lives. In other words, it makes us into like any other creature on the planet. And when it does so, our politics becomes that of survival. And my most recent example of that comes from the Australian firestorms that ravaged the country in 2019, 2020. So we're going back to early last year, when the situation was so critical that the Australian government made a decision to kill 10,000 or so camels, feral camels, which have an interesting colonial history as to why they landed up in Australia. But these are camels that had gone feral in the Australian big desert in the middle of the country, and the government decided to kill these camels, 10,000 of them, because they were competing with a group of human beings and Aboriginal community for water. So when Australia saw these firestorms, you could see that humans and camels suddenly became two creatures competing for the same resource, water. And that's what I call being reduced to the politics of pure survival. Whereas when we think of politics otherwise, we think of politics as a sphere, as a normative sphere, as the sphere in which we work out the moral rules of a society. But when we are faced with the planet's fury, that's what the planet does. And in that sense, there is a lack of mutuality. And we can, again, if you are interested, we can talk about that topic later on. So in that sense, I make a distinction then between sustainability and habitability, because sustainability, which has been Paul Ward's history of sustainability, takes it back to 18th century Germany, takes it back to people like Liebig and their sense of nutrition in the soil, that they felt early capitalism was robbing the soil of, and Marxist discussion on this has been made famous by many Marxist environmentalists. And then even German ideas of forest management, which later influenced fisheries management. So sustainability has a history which is part of this history of the global world. And I think sustainability, people who are writing on sustainability, even with the Brundtland Commission definition of it, agree that it's a human-centered concept. Sustainability is not about life in general. Whereas people who have worked on the planet, including people like James Lovelock in the 60s and James Hansen, the American guru of modern climate science, have actually asked a question which in planetary science is known as the question of habitability, which is what makes a planet habitable to life, not just human life. And their argument often is that if the lower forms of life cannot exist and persist, humans cannot exist. And there's a fascinating moment in Carl Sagan's time when his unit in NASA was thinking about how to make Mars inhabitable for humans, that at a meeting, Lovelock actually said, make it first inhabitable for bacteria. If you do that, it will automatically become inhabitable for humans over time. So habitability is both, it comes out of comparative questions about planets. Why is Mars so cold and Venus so hot? Why is Earth exactly right for the kind of, the Goldilocks planet is exactly right for the kind of complex multicellular life? Why has life persisted on Earth in spite of 5 big extinctions? So these are the habitability question. It has not been answered. People don't know why, but the question has raised itself. And so the center of the planet as a perspective is this question of habitability, what that is life in general. And that's why when you think about the climate crisis, or even the pandemic, the question of biodiversity becomes extremely important. And therefore the event horizon in thinking about the crisis through a planetary perspective is, of course, the threat of a 6th great extinction, which some people argue we are in the beginning of, which some people argue may happen in the next 300 to 600 years. But that's the perspectival arc in which you place the current situation. Whereas when you think of think of the world through the history of the globe, you think of 500 years of empires, capitalism, loosely using the word. You think of inequalities, you think of power relationships, and sustainability is solidly there, and debates about the kind of points that I think Sigurd was making, whether capitalism is compatible with sustainability is absolutely a valid question, whereas many capitalists would argue that green capitalism is possible, but that's an open question. So, and the last point I want to make in this section is to say that, again, we can take it up, that the global, because it's made by humans and it's about power and inequality, colonialism and the capitalism, is constitutionally political and gives rise to political thought. And actually, the globe is politicizable. The planet can reduce us to being one among many creatures, but the planet is not politicizable in the same way, in my category planet. So sometimes, people criticize me, and actually in the book that Frank has edited on social theory in the Anthropocene, the German collection, where the book begins with the translation of my essay on planet as a category, and with a critique by Christophe Bonnery, who points out legitimately and rightly that there have been many different conceptions of the planet. As people do with the word globe, they say there are many different understandings of the globe, and that's a perfectly valid point to make. But what I do want to say to that is that it's a valid point, but it again brings us back into human history, because you're really talking about different conceptions that humans have had of the globe and the planet. And by doing so, we're back into into the business of anthropocentrism, where I'm trying to look for an Archimedean point where I find a humanist and a human way of decentering humans. I mean, after all, I'm a human being, so I can't do it from a polar bear's point of view. I can't do it from the point of view of salmon or fish that is going extinct. That's why I find both Earth system science so fascinating, because it is a combination of geology and biology and evolutionary biology, and those are areas in which humans are, by their own arguments, decentered, can't be at the center of their stories. So what connects then? The argument I would make broadly is that it's really the intensification of globalization and this intensification of our technological experiments that eventually has disclosed to humans the domain of the planetary. In other words, Paul Crutzen in an interview put it very nicely. He was trying to say that, look, the very technology that destroys the planet also makes available to us a diagnostic science, which at least gives rise to the hope that we might be able to even find solutions. But and an interesting case in point in terms of the science of global warming is that, think of how much the statements that the world hasn't seen this kind of fast warming for at least 800,000 years depends on scientists having been able to find air that is 800,000 years old, and the only way you find it is by boring into polar ice to find air trapped in that kind of ice or snow. And how do you bore? What do you drill with? You drill with the same kind of technology that the oil companies drill the earth with, except that the drilling equipment has to be modified for the conditions of snow and ice. So in that sense, technology is critical to both our encounter with the planet and so I want to talk a little bit about the relationship between technology and and the situation we're in. Frank already mentioned the idea of great acceleration. Most of you, I assume, are familiar with it. I'm sure you're familiar with, if you are, you're familiar with the graphs that Will Steffen and John McNeil and others produced, called the great acceleration graphs, which I'm not showing you because my Zoom connection is a little shaky, and I don't want to lose, I don't want it to crash. But if you remember it, it actually basically shows a correlation from 1951, and Frank mentioned 1950, between all the things that humans were doing, expanding their economic productivity and production, and the way in which the planet responded to human expansion of human activities and the acceleration of human activities by accelerating the production of greenhouse gases, nitrous oxide, methane, carbon dioxide, etc. Which is why this period they called it after, from Karl Polanyi, they took this idea of the idea of great transformation and used it to come up with this expression, great acceleration. For the 20th century, very quickly, if you look at the figures for the 20th century, it took Homo sapiens, if Homo sapiens have been around for 300,000 years, we reached the figure of 1 billion close to 1900. So in 1900, we were about 1.5. At the end of the century, that is at the end of the last century, we were 6 billion. The world economy increased 15-fold. Energy use increased from 13 to 14-fold. Freshwater use increased 9-fold. Irrigated areas by 5-fold. Fish catch by 65 times. Irrigated oil production by 300 times. Fertilizer used by 342 times. World organic chemical production increased by 1,000 times. Car ownership increased by almost 8,000 times. So suddenly, humans lived well, and then sometimes jokingly I say that the Steven Pinker period of human history began. Steven Pinker argues this point that that humanity is just improving, flourishing, and we have a great sort of rosier and rosier future ahead of us. But that is his position. So, and there is human flourishing. You can see it. Human beings have never lived so well, and it always reminds me of a joke, if I can remember it correctly, that Kant makes in The Conflict of Faculties, where there's a doctor who is always saying to his patients, "You're improving," and the patient comes in and says, "But doctor, I'm dying from this continuous improvement." But the acceleration it gets sharper from the 1970s on. If you look at the number of people who consume things, the consuming classes, where the majority are now from China, India, and these places. Even in 2000, they were mostly from the developed countries, Europe, North America. So the first billion of consuming classes, the number was reached about 1986 or 85. And in 21 years, the number was 2. The second billion took 21 years to produce. The third billion took 9 years to produce. And they're imagining that the fourth billion will take 7 years to produce. Now, all that is, alongside that, humans have also taken on the role of being the biggest geomorphological agent on the planet. In other words, we reshape the landscape of the planet. And I mean, I won't go into the details for sake of time, but we are now the biggest Earth moving agents on the planet. Um, and so technology is central to the story. And the geologist Peter Heff from Duke University has put forward his idea of technosphere, where he basically argues that if you think of the planet, you can't simply think of the lithosphere, the biosphere, the atmosphere, the stratosphere. You have to also imagine this planet having being covered by a thin film that he calls the technosphere, which is all the technology that connects humanity throughout the planet. And his argument is that it's really impossible to sustain 7.5 billion or 8 billion human beings, or the coming figures that we sometimes get of 9 or 10 billion human beings without this technology. So, so he argues that technology has become the precondition for biology, and which again reminds me of a point that Carl Schmitt made in this imaginary dialogues he created, which has been published in this book. In English, it's called Dialogue on Space and Power, where he makes the point that what even globalization produced is what he calls, in English, it's translated as unencumbered technology. In other words, if you think of technology, humans using technology on land, then that technology is encumbered with our social structures, with our life processes, with animals we have, all of those things. So he think of that technology as encumbered technology. But the ship, the ocean-going ship for him, was the first instance of unencumbered technology. In other words, a situation where if the technology didn't work, your life would just be destroyed if you're on that sort of a ship. Which is why you see shipwrecks have played such a very important role in modern imagination, both philosophically but also culturally. I mean, so many Western cities actually have shipwreck museums. But if you think of the ship, whether a sailing ship or a modern ship or the airplane, I mean, if you think of unencumbered technology being the technology on which our life depends. If the technology fails, we go, then the argument about the technosphere is that we have already made this Earth into like a spaceship for us. If the technosphere is the precondition for human survival in such large numbers, and to sustain these numbers, then that is an instance of what Schmitt called unencumbered technology. And so what I then want to argue in the maybe 20 minutes given to me is that, okay, I have a little more time. But so the argument about the technosphere also is that you can't simply think of humans as dominant species. There's a dominance complex that is dominating order of life, and that complex includes humans. It includes technology. It includes the animals we keep to eat or to eat their products. So, and also other species that depend on our survival, like in North America, the urban squirrels wouldn't survive if humans were not around. The foxes or coyotes would immediately eat them up. So there is so humans plus the animals and other life forms that actually co-survive with us and the technology, this together is the dominant complex that dominates the order of life and is creating problems for us as well. And so faced with the crisis, so faced or being put in this situation, what do humans do? And this is the concept I want to talk about in the, I'm reaching the concluding, not the conclusion, but moving towards the concluding section of my talk, which is that there are two things. Technological civilization produces eventually urban civilizations. And it's not surprising that humanity is increasingly becoming an urban dwelling species. Even in a place like India, it's still 60% of the population, 65% are in the villages, but an exodus towards cities is visible. And most cities are becoming mega cities, which Mike Davis, the geographer, once explained very well in a book that he called A Planet of Slums. But the solution to that is sometimes spoke of in China and India in terms of building smart cities, but cities nevertheless. And that actually has a deep consequence, a real consequence for how we think about human history moving forward. So the issue I want to raise is how being kind of caught in the middle of, or between what I'm calling the planetary and the global. So humans are in a situation where a vague consciousness of the planet is coming into our vocabulary, even if we don't think about it. So a kind of distinction between human time and this large scale time of the planet is not only emerging in our consciousness, it is something we often at different levels negotiate. And I want to talk about how we negotiate these different kind of times. So take, for instance, the way in which in everyday language, thanks to the media, we talk about renewable and non-renewable fuels. And many climate scientists have pointed out that the distinction between renewable and non-renewable fuel is really a distinction between what matters on human timescale and what matters on planetary timescale. Because if humans could wait around for a few 100 million years, the planet probably will again make fossil fuels. They could be quite perfectly renewable. So if we were creatures who lived for 300 million years individually, then we would be facing a very different planet. The fact that we live, even thanks to modern medicine, like for 70, 80 years, means that we often make decisions on certain scales, both institutionally and in our own lives. And to make such decisions, we then have to interscale, what anthropologists call interscaling, which means how we convert another scale, a larger scale, back into the scale of our lives. Now, we can't do it with everything, but we try to do this precisely in situations where the planetary and global kind of comes together in our own lives. If I can, I'll try to see if I can show you a very quick instance of what I'm calling interscaling. So, Frank, I'm going to do a bit of risky experiment, showing a couple of slides. If something happens, then I'll come back. I'll just reboot and come back. But I'm hoping this will work. So I'm just going to some slides. So I have to go back to. Can I share screen? Do I have the authority to share screen? If I want to share screen.
I think you should have it, yes.
Yeah, I can. So I'll just so these are great acceleration graphs, but I just want to quickly show you this other picture. Can you see this little child around an earth moving machine? Now, he's a colleague's child, and the lovely young boy, he was 2 then when the picture was taken. And the same child, so here he is with this real life scale earth moving machine, an urban, these are ubiquitous, you see them everywhere. And then one day, I found him in a park playing with toy size replicas of earth moving machinery. So this is kind of interscaling. This is sort of, now here, of course, his parents bought this for him, thinking that, rightly perhaps, that these are developmental toys for children. But this is how you scale things back into human time scale. So this is part of his growing up. It's coming to the, and as children tend to think, I'm sure, it also naturalizes the technology. So he would grow up thinking that this is what humans do. So I'll just stop sharing the screen. And okay, so this is what I was calling interscaling. And one example of interscaling that I want to discuss with you, which is which will help me to make my point, is the whole question of air conditioning sales in India. Indian cities are becoming heat islands, and air conditioning sales have been booming. And the most interesting thing about this is that sales are booming because Indian families that had never had never had air conditioners before are buying air conditioners. So so it's the first unit purchaser. And these are people from sometimes from the slums, sometimes from very lower middle class families. Some New York Times reporter and a colleague of mine, an economist called Michael Greenstone, did some research on these purchasers. So the interesting thing is this: the issue is so important in India that when hundreds of nations got together in 2016 in Kigali in Rwanda to discuss the air conditioner problem, which goes back to Paul Crutzen's the problem that he was dealing with in the ozone and the hole in the ozone layer case. India bargained very, very hard to be amongst the group of countries that would be the slowest to change, because the demand was that they should be using modern air conditioners, which are environmental friendly, but more expensive and require more trained labor force. But if you go to India and look at the air conditioners, you'll find that these air conditioners are, if not manufactured, they can be assembled in a local garage. You can go out in your neighborhood and ask somebody to come and fix your air conditioners, but they're deadly for the atmosphere. Delhi at the moment has about 5 or 6 days in the year when the heat in the city is unbearable. The prediction is that by the end of the century, Delhi will have some 70 to 95 such days. But the air conditioners actually are making the city even hotter. But when people went out and asked the purchasers of the air conditioner what air conditioning was doing for them, they got answers like somebody said, look, it's the first time that my children can sit up all night and prepare for their medical school entrance examination without getting eaten up by mosquitoes. Or a family where 7 or 8 people lived in a room said, for the first time, we got to know what sleep was. And we have such a sense of well-being. And studies in Texas have actually shown in America that air conditioning does save lives. So you can see what's happening now in India. The city is actually faced with a planetary problem. And the bigger these cities are, clearly they have to, the cities are becoming more and more unlivable in the summer. But people have their lives. And if you ask those parents, they would say, look, I might be contributing to making the city hotter. But by the time Delhi gets uninhabitable, my children will have already acquired the education and the skills with which to move somewhere else that is livable. So their trade-off is between the future of the city and the future of their children. That is interscaling, because that they are precisely thinking how families think in terms of what is good for their children, maybe grandchildren, but not beyond that. Whereas the city actually requires people to think in much longer terms if the city has to remain livable. And one of the problems you face, and this is kind of point I want to end with. I still have 10 minutes left. And one of the points you see is that when you begin to live in these mega cities, we become civilizationally much less flexible in what we can do. I mean, if you're talking about Indian countryside, if India was still in the colonial period, the economy would have been mostly solar powered in the 19th century. And then people would have lived in little village hamlets. And it's always easy to evacuate a small hamlet. But if there's a crisis, you can't go to a city of 20 million people and say, evacuate tomorrow. So therefore, this bargaining with nature, and therefore the option to use technology to get a few more years out of a cruel habitation, out of a situation that is inherently cruel, a situation that is inherently saying, look, the city may become uninhabitable precisely for what you're doing, but you might say, but I'm not going to be here for 80 years. Maybe my children won't be, but by making the city worse, I can get 10 more good years, and my child can be a doctor. And once he's a doctor, he'll be more mobile. So this upwardly mobile section, then you see a prime minister, whoever is the prime minister in India, has to be responsive to that revolution of aspiration, which has been part of globalization. So that's a kind of interscaling movement that people are making. And the same thing I would say, I don't have the time, otherwise I've gone into details of it, with the pandemic. So everybody has agreed, including Anthony Fauci, who was Trump's main person for infectious diseases control, that we are in the era of pandemics. Because if you look at the frequency of pandemics in the last 20 years, it's clear that 70% of the new infections have been zoonotic, and that they have to do with ecological destruction, particularly destruction of forests. Fauci says that he and his colleague produced a academic paper in a biology paper called in a biology journal last September, where they clearly argued this out. And actually, he said if you wanted to write a thriller, he said, human beings have destroyed all the other predators except viruses and bacteria and these microbes. And because of the expansion of human economy, human presence, the Steven Pinker age of human flourishing, we are now in a sort of competition with these microbial organisms, which are also, we have friendly versions of them in our bodies. And he said, if you wanted to write a fiction about this war between us and the viruses, you'd have to call it, and he quoted some other scientists who said this, you'd have to call it their genes versus our wit, our intelligence. And clearly one logical option, I think as Sigurd was saying, is clearly for humans to kind of scale back, make sure that we don't destroy forests, make sure that we don't force wildlife to come so close to us. And that's something that in America, a person like E.O. Wilson would actually recommend. In his book Half Earth, he would say leave half of the land surface or the surface of the planet for other creatures. Whereas our expansive situation, we'll find it very hard to actually, given the structures of capitalism that Sigurd was talking about, the interest that states have in building roads, not just corporations or mining companies, but actually governments go in and build roads to enable mining companies to do their work. Given the kind of infrastructure we built, we are then constrained to find technological scientific solutions. So more pandemics, more vaccines, thinking that, you can already see how much trouble we are getting with this RNA coronavirus because of its quick mutation and new strains coming up. So people the virologists who actually see that we're in an era of pandemic, but who think alongside capitalists. In other words, they're not thinking of changing the capitalist system. They think we have to deal with it through the the system we've got. They speak of trying to create a quick response, almost a commando force-like force. So they imagine WHO getting more powers, giving the organization more teeth, so that if a pandemic breaks out somewhere, they want to create an early warning system. So they want to actually create a system whereby you monitor people's cell phone messages. So they want the entire world to have cell phones so that you can actually monitor any news about the outbreak of a pandemic. And this commando force would move in, and nation states would have to give them the power to do that in order to immediately contain the pandemic and make sure that this didn't become a pandemic. Now, the fascinating thing about that is, of course, see, they're also thinking of a planetary governance, except that they want to do it through technology, through vaccination production, through containment, by taking political power out of the states a little bit, creating a super kind of planetary agency that will manage pandemics. It hasn't happened yet, but you can see the logic. The logic is actually about this planetary policing coupled with technology, coupled with science. And therefore, the same logic is at work with propositions about geoengineering. So David Keith in Harvard, this physicist who has been given money by Gates Foundation to create, I mean, it's actually beyond, I think, the experimental stage. They want to do some big experiments in the atmosphere, spreading aerosol sulfate to scatter sunlight. And as somebody pointed out, the geologist pointed out that if you did so, even to buy time, humans will have to get used to living with a sky that is permanently white. The blue sky will go because of scattered light. Not to speak of all the other real problems of politics that this might give rise to. So let me end there to say that clearly there are two paths forward. One is to acknowledge the ecological crisis, the planetary crisis, in all its different ramifications, and interscale in such a way so as to make sure that humans scale back, that we accept, we become more tolerant of refugees, not just humans, but other kind of climate refugees, animals, plants, but humans too. So we have anti-racist policies. Philosophically, humans would have to understand that they are only a minority form of life. The majority form of life is microbial on the planet. And the more important form of life, actually the so-called forms of life we consider inferior, but they manage the business of life on this planet. So human concerned with sustainability will have to speak to our other planetary concern about habitability and be in sync. And that's one way to go, which may not be compatible, as Sigurd was saying, with a kind of consumerist capitalism that will just want to eat up everything. But on the other hand, the reality is that we have an increasingly urban, megacity-based civilization, and which depends on technosphere, both from artificial fertilizers to all kinds of other connectivities. And the moment we are into that kind of a civilization, our room for maneuver in terms of a radical change reduces. So we think of, so there's a natural attraction for technological scientific fixes. But we know that there's no guarantee. But you can see the gamble on technology in the Paris climate deal, where it was assumed that nations agreed on the assumption that by 2070 we will have technology to ensure that the emissions become negative. So we'll not only be not producing any emissions, zero emissions, but we will be taking the existing stock of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere and scrubbing the atmosphere clean and sequestering it somewhere safely. We don't have the technology yet, but that gamble is written in the fine print of the Paris deal. And I think this propensity for technological gambling is reinforced by the fact that the more you are part of these huge, big infrastructural civilizational projects, the lesser is the room for maneuver that you have for radical change. And I think so we're at this crossroads where philosophically you can see what Bruno Latour is saying, you can see what Isabel Sengers is saying, you can see what Donna Haraway is saying, you can see what all the post-humanists are saying. But practically, we are in this situation where to an individual person in a hot city like Delhi, the purchase of an air conditioner makes complete sense in terms of the difference between what I call human time and the time of the planet, but in terms of interscaling, interweaving between our two senses of those times. So I'll stop here. My time is over, my human time, and my part of the conference time. And I'd be happy to have questions if there are any. Thank you very, very much for your patience.